High on the northern edge of the university campus, the old library waited in hushed silence. Built from rough-hewn stones, it stretched like a mausoleum under the milky brightness of the street lamps. The building had stood for centuries, weathering storms, crises, and the shifting sands of scholarship. Hardly anyone entered after sundown. Those who did, if they stayed too long, emerged as if they had seen something searingly intimate, something they couldn't quite describe, but which followed them out into the night like a shadow. Ruth Morrow, a doctoral candidate in English literature, arrived one late evening determined to gain access to the library's restricted section. Her breath quickened as she tugged open the ancient door. The monstrous brass handle felt oddly warm against her palm despite the October chill. Entering, she was met by the distinctive perfume of old paper and polished wood. Overhead, the chandelier's bulbs flickered, casting shadows across the tall shelves that soared like cathedral spires. Ruth coughed into the silence. She was alone, but not entirely, she felt. The librarian on duty, Mr. Whitby, was presumably in his office, a cramped corner full of archaic filing cabinets. His presence was always easy to miss, overshadowed by the library's brooding atmosphere. She kept moving deeper, guided by memory toward the eastern wing. The library was open late only once a week, so she had chosen this evening to carry out her plan. She had studied rumors that the restricted section contained odd manuscripts known to incite bizarre illusions, as well as a collection of letters allegedly associated with tragic authors. Of particular interest were the so-called forbidden scripts, rumored to reveal long-lost scenes of authors' final moments. Some spoke of a curse. Read them and you wouldn't sleep. Read them aloud and you'd awaken ghosts. Ruth had interviewed faculty members and combed old archives to find a clue to the location of these hidden texts. No one would speak openly except for cryptic references. Check the locked cabinets, a bored archivist had said, or dig behind the third row from the right in the restricted section. Tonight, Ruth intended to do exactly that. She reached the restricted section's tall oak doors. They bore elaborate ironwork that spiraled like calligraphy. A tarnished sign read, "For authorized personnel only." She tested the handle. Locked. She tried the old keys Mr. Whitby had let her borrow under the pretense of referencing rare volumes. The door clicked open with a groan so soft it felt like a plaintive sigh. Stepping inside, she sensed the air cool. The hush within the restricted zone was absolute, as though even the dust motes floated in a vacuum. Wooden cabinets lined the walls, their glass windows glazed with years of grime. She slowed, scanning for any sign of the file labeled A5 or C9, the cryptic references she'd seen in footnotes of campus legends. In the far corner, partially hidden behind a battered rolling ladder, she found it, a narrower, older cabinet that seemed out of place. Its glass door was cracked, held together by strips of hardened adhesive. Yellowed labels, half peeled, indicated an archaic cataloging system. It was locked, of course, but someone or something had left behind a faint wedge at the top, as if a blade or letter opener had been inserted. She pulled carefully. It resisted for a moment, then creaked open with a pitiful squeal. Inside sat a stack of manuscripts arranged haphazardly. Carefully she slid them free, scanning their ornate spines and worn covers. She recognized one from her research, a battered folio called Scenes of Distress. There were others too, labeled in spidery handwriting. Late writings of the doomed, last confessions. She was shaken to find another hidden behind them, almost invisible in the gloom. Its black quilted cover was bound by a thin silver cord. There was no title on the spine. She slipped off the cord, feeling her pulse flutter. The first page was surprisingly blank, except for a single line, scrawled in cramped script. "They who read the final words shall conjure the tragedy anew." Her heart thudded as she turned the page. The script began as a biography of a famous writer, describing his personal torment in the final moments before his death. Words scrolled across the paper in archaic spelling, their meaning half lost to time but still decipherable enough to convey a sense of looming disaster. She barely realized that time was passing. Hours seemed to vanish as she read, transfixed by descriptions of suicides, illnesses, mysterious accidents. The edges of her mind prickled with a creeping sense that she was no longer alone. She nearly jumped out of her skin when the library's distant grandfather clock chimed midnight. The staccato sound echoed strangely, like knocks resounding in an empty tomb. Only then did she notice an almost imperceptible haze in the library. Was it dust or candle smoke? But there were no candles, only the electric sconces. She tried ignoring it, but the haze seemed to move of its own accord. She shut the black-covered folio, tying the cord back. Then she slid the entire set of manuscripts into her satchel, as quietly as she could, afraid of drawing Mr. Whitby's attention, or more, unsettlingly, attracting the scrutiny of whatever presence the haze might contain. She crept out of the restricted section, locked it behind her, and hurried to the main hall. There she glimpsed Mr. Whitby standing behind the librarian's desk, eyes drooping from exhaustion, or perhaps from a dreams-filled half-sleep. She quietly placed the keys on his desk. He didn't stir. Exiting into the crisp night, she was met by a swirl of wind that rustled the autumn leaves. She felt as if the library stared after her, exhaling its ancient breath into the open air. Ruth lived in a cramped studio apartment overlooking a narrow side street. The overhead light flickered ominously, but she flicked it on, determined to read. She emptied her satchel onto the table, the manuscripts spilling out in tangles of parchment. She fought off an irrational fear. She was alone, safe in her locked apartment. She would read quickly, type notes, and then return the manuscripts, no harm done. She started with the battered folio, scenes of distress. Inside were details about a tragic poet who had drowned in a questionable accident. Next was a letter from another author describing feverish visions of crypts just days before his demise. There were references to a deeper compilation, an older text that had apparently caused the authors themselves to succumb to madness. But the letters ended abruptly. She turned page after page of recensions and anecdotes until she stumbled onto a passage titled, "The Conjuring of Forgotten Words." It instructed, "Read aloud the last lines penned by a dying author, and the dead shall gather with renewed breath. Let them show you the scene and speak it as truth." Ruth swallowed hard. A wave of goosebumps prickled her arms. Something in her refused to read any further, but curiosity gnawed. She flipped open the black quilted folio again and scanned for the final lines. She read them silently at first, a snippet from an 18th century poet, scribbled at the end of his incomplete epic. Then her whisper grew louder, almost involuntarily. She spoke the final line softly, her voice trembling on the last syllable. The temperature in her apartment plummeted. The overhead light crackled like static. A sudden flutter by the window made her look up in alarm. She saw a figure with watery eyes, clothing drenched, pressed to the glass from the outside as if drowning in the air itself. She spun around, heart hammering. The figure was gone. The next evening, she tried to rationalize it as a trick of the light. She had had too little sleep, too much coffee. That was all. She resumed reading, but the words on the page felt heavier, more potent, as if infused with a living current. This time she came upon an excerpt from a novelist known for his horrifying tales. Found dead under suspicious circumstances. Before she could silence her tongue, she found the text coming out in a quiet murmur. "I have looked upon the face of the night, and it sees me back." A sudden hiss cut through the room, followed by a shriek that sounded impossibly close. A shape flickered beside her bookshelf. A hunched man, eyes clouded with terror, chest rising and falling in ragged gasps. He was dressed in period attire, mouth twisted as though screaming in silence. Ruth felt an icy jolt through her spine. She stumbled to switch on a lamp, and in that instant the figure flickered out like a dying flame. Yet the momentary image remained seared in her mind. She collapsed onto her armchair, utterly shaken, still clutching the black folio. It was real. More real than any hallucination brought on by exhaustion. She steeled herself and flipped pages to see if there was some explanation or warning. Instead, the final lines of the 19th century novelist merely repeated themselves, trailing off into an inky scrawl. Unable to sleep, she returned to campus before dawn. The library wouldn't open for hours, so she lurked outside, shifting from foot to foot under the building's grand facade. She felt certain that returning these manuscripts would silence the ghosts. At least, that was what she silently prayed. When the doors finally opened, Mr. Whitby was nowhere to be seen. Another librarian recognized Ruth and let her in, oblivious to the manuscripts concealed in her bag. The library's musty warmth unsettled her. She navigated swiftly to the restricted section to place the texts back where she had found them, but when she arrived, she discovered the cabinet door was wide open, the broken glass pane glinting under the overhead lights. Everything inside had been ransacked, as if rummaged through violently. Her heart sank. She looked around to see if somewhere else might hold them. The disarray suggested that someone with knowledge of these volumes had come searching. Could it have been a caretaker? Another scholar? Whoever it was, they'd left the place in shambles. She looked down at the manuscripts in her hands. Should she leave them among the scattered pages, or hide them elsewhere? A fleeting dread kept her from letting them go. Some compulsion told her that until she reconciled what she had read, she couldn't simply discard them. She decided to find Mr. Whitby. After a frantic search, she discovered him in the dim corridor behind the librarian's desk, half doubled over an oaken table. He was clasping a small dusty book that made his fingers tremble. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his lips were moving in silent conversation with an unseen presence. Ruth froze. "Mr. Whitby?" she asked. He turned with the jerkiness of someone wrenched from a nightmare. "Ruth," he said in a rasp, "what are you doing here so early?" She pointed at the battered pages in his hand. You've seen them too?" He swallowed hard. "Years ago, I found some of the library's forbidden scripts. I read them. At first it was all research for my dissertation, until the visions started. I tried to hide them, but apparently not well enough. They call for an audience, like hungry spirits desperate for a voice." She opened her satchel, showing the manuscripts. His eyes widened. "You have them?" he said bleakly. "It's not safe to read them alone. I've summoned ghosts," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They appear and reenact the final moments of authors. Real or illusions, I can't tell. She shook her head, unable to continue. Mr. Whitby lifted a trembling hand. "They're real enough. Each script is a fragment of a doomed writer's last words. Reading them out loud conjures energies that yearn to relieve the act of dying. They replicate their final scenes in our world. Is there a way to stop it?" she asked. "I don't want to see these ghosts anymore." Mr. Whitby set his own item aside, a battered pamphlet with half the pages missing. "We must gather them all. There's supposedly a method to banish these ghosts back to the realm of the printed word. A final invocation that locks them away. But it requires reading a concluding text that's hidden among the manuscripts." Without further hesitation, he led Ruth into a side office. The overhead lights were old, flickering at intervals that made them appear half alive. They spread the forbidden texts atop a worn table. Whitby flipped through them, scanning quickly, muttering references in hushed confusion. Pages rustled, and now and then he would pause to read a few lines, only to shut his mouth and flip the page as though it burned him. Ruth wasn't sure which of them spoke first about verifying the final text. Perhaps they said it in unison, propelled by the same anxious realization. But they found no sign of any concluding text. Each manuscript displayed an abrupt end, incomplete paragraphs, or scattered lines that did not appear to connect to a grand final statement. Yet the references were consistent. A culminating page that, once read, would put the ghosts to rest. As they flipped through the black folio, the library's overhead lights blinked, and an icy breeze swept through the corridor. The door to the main hall groaned. Everything fell under an oppressive hush, as if the library itself was holding its breath. "I sense them," Whitby murmured. "They want to speak." She heard the manifestations before she saw them. A faint whisper of a quill on parchment, the rustle of bodily movement from behind invisible curtains. There came the soft sobbing of a voice, a poet wasting away in a sickbed. Then a strangled scream, perhaps from a dramatist who met a violent end. The ghosts were converging, forming a slow parade of tragedies that night flooded the corridors. Ruth inhaled sharply as she saw a flickering candlelit figure emerge from behind a bookshelf near them. He wore an antique frock coat, collar askew, his face ashen with final despair. He raised a quivering hand toward Ruth and seemed on the brink of speaking, but his lips formed only a silent moan before the figure dissipated. Another ghost drifted by, stepping through the wall, trailing in her wake the smell of old ink and damp earth. "We must find the concluding text," Whitby hissed. "Where could it be?" she asked, swallowing dread. He gestured to a corridor branching off the main reading room leading to the library's basement. "The oldest acquisitions are stored below. It might be hidden among partially catalogued boxes." They made their way down the stairs, the ghost's presence pressed around them like a suffocating blanket. Each step deeper into the basement was accompanied by illusions of authors creeping at the edges of their vision. With each shift of light and dark, a new specter surfaced, a pale woman wearing a Regency gown, eyes wide with the terror of sudden mortality. A man with ink-stained fingers who kept frantically shaking his hand, as if to finish writing something before it was too late. The entire basement throbbed with despair. Their flashlights illuminated hulking file cabinets and metal shelves stacked with boxes older than the library's official records. Dust swirled on the cold stone floor. They searched, desperation growing, flipping open crates of moth-eaten books. Another presence glided past them, a ghost in a black cloak, perhaps from medieval times, who paused in front of Ruth. She heard his rattling breath. Then he faded. Moments later, Whitby let out a sharp cry. He held up a single sheet of parchment that looked as though it had been ripped from a larger volume. "Look at this," he said. It bore an inscription in the same cramped script that Ruth had seen in the black folio. "The means to quell them is to utter the summation of the passing." A short passage followed, reminiscent of a liturgy. At the bottom was a cryptic note referencing a hidden compartment in the library's main hall. "The final page is bound behind the face of the clock." They exchanged a grim look and hurried upstairs. The ghosts seemed to be gathering in the main reading area, drifting between the towering shelves. Some hovered near the entrance, others paced the corridors, reenacting half-finished pantomimes of anguish. Thunder rattled the high windows. She and Mr. Whitby approached the library's centuries-old grandfather clock, which stood nearly 8 feet tall, carved from dark mahogany. Its face displayed Roman numerals, the minute hand ticking forward with the steadiness of a heartbeat. Whitby crawled around the back, running his fingers along the seams. "It's locked," he muttered. They pressed on sections of wood, searching for a hidden latch. Outside, lightning flared, throwing monstrous shadows across the walls. A flicker of spectral light coalesced behind them, and Ruth stole a glance over her shoulder. More ghosts. A man clutching at his chest, the way someone does in the throes of a fatal attack. A woman with tears streaming down her cheeks, reaching out blind hands. "Hurry," Ruth whispered. Whitby found a hidden hinge and pried it with the tip of a letter opener. The panel clicked. Inside the cavity, a folded piece of parchment lay nestled among cobwebs. They withdrew it carefully. The final page was headed by the phrase, "Summation of the Passing." Beneath was a series of lines in archaic English, presumably the full invocation to banish the conjured spirits. Some of the words were nearly illegible. Whitby's pale face set with determination. "Let's do it," Ruth said, voice trembling. The ghosts sensed their purpose. The reading room filled with an invisible current of dread. Shelves rattled, the overhead light bulbs popping one by one in quick cracks, leaving only the uncertain glow of the lamps near the study desks. Standing side by side, they began to read in halting unison. "By the words of the living, in the hush of these halls, we gather all endings so silence befalls." A reverberation spread through the floor. The spectral illusions surged forward in silent screams. Ruth felt a presence brush past her, clammy as a frigid wind. Mr. Whitby's voice wavered. A gloom pressed in from all sides as the ghosts attempted to break their concentration. "Let the final lines rest. Let their voices find peace. By the quill and the page may their haunting now cease." Thunder shook the windows. The entire library seemed to sway, as if the walls themselves trembled. The overhead chandelier erupted in sparks, plunging them into near darkness. Still they continued to read, forging on through the archaic language, syllables that felt alien on their tongues. In the swirling gloom, the ghosts glowed like ephemeral lanterns. Dozens of them crowded around, each face twisted in pain or sorrow, all drawn by the gravitational pull of the reading. As Ruth and Whitby reached the final sentence, she sensed the swirling mass converge into a single wave of anguished moans. She found her voice faltering. Whitby clenched his teeth, gripping Ruth's arm to steady them both. Together they uttered the closing line. So be it spoke, so be it wrought, in the hush of the library oblivion is sought. Silence. A sudden, all-encompassing hush descended, abruptly suffocating the storm of moaning and rattling shelves. The ghosts dimmed, their forms flickering, as though a breaker had switched off their source of power. One by one, they dissolved into thin air. The last specter was a hunched figure who had lingered near the door. It turned its hollow eyes toward Ruth in a final, pleading look before vanishing, drawn back into the realm of unread words. Ruth realized her heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. The library's gloom receded. What remained in the reading room was the heavy weight of aftermath, a feeling of solemn containment, as though some tension in the air had finally relaxed. Then, faintly at first, she heard a ticking. The grandfather clock was still running, its pendulum swaying. Time marched on, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. Crawford led Ruth back to his office. His expression changed, softer somehow, as if the despair that had haunted him for years had lifted. He placed the final page within the black folio, tying it there with that thin silver cord. "What do we do with them now?" Ruth asked, looking at the manuscripts spread across the table. He leaned against the desk, letting out a long breath. "We must keep them locked away, for good. I think it's safer if the pages remain here, in the library archives, but in a secure location where no one else can read them aloud. Perhaps we'll need new locks. Or no reference at all in the library's catalog." She nodded. "I can't believe how quickly it all escalated. What if someone stumbles across them again?" He placed the manuscripts lovingly into a metal lockbox, carefully, as if cradling something alive but dangerous. "We'll make sure no one else can open it without special permission. We'll inform only the head archivist. It will be coded into the library's new system as sealed documents." Ruth brushed her palm over the battered folio's cover, the path of her curiosity. She felt a pang of sorrow for the ghosts, for all those authors who had yearned to be read even in death. The illusions, or perhaps real spirits, had found a fragile window back into the mortal world. They had sought to retell their last words, to find some intangible closure. Standing in the doorway of Whitby's office, she realized she was trembling, not just from dread, but from the aftershock of encountering such raw emotion. Her mind echoed with phrases and lines from those final notes. The hush in her ears felt different now, not merely an absence of sound, but a sense of deeper understanding. She wasn't sure if she would ever be able to read again without recalling the hush that fell when the ghost dispersed. Having sealed the forbidden manuscripts in the lockbox, Mr. Whitby escorted her to the main entrance. The library felt strangely normal under the newly restored lights, as if the building had reabsorbed the darkness and was determined to present its usual stoic facade. The janitor mopped the marble floor, not seeming to notice the shattered bulbs or the faint scorch marks on the chandelier's wiring. Ruth turned to Whitby. "Thank you for guiding me through this," she said softly. He gave a weary smile. "I couldn't have done it alone. If you hadn't found that black folio, and if we hadn't read the final invocation, those spirits might have become a permanent fixture." Outside, the first blush of dawn colored the horizon. The air was crisp after the storm. She stepped into the pale morning light, hugging her coat tighter. There, on the library steps, she paused, glancing back at the imposing silhouette of the building. It seemed to loom with a guarded hush, keeping its secrets well behind the locked doors. And yet, there was a cleanliness to the air, a sense of resolution. She felt the dryness in her throat, reminding her that she had done something that few others would believe if she tried to explain it. She didn't know if she would ever speak of these events, Possibly the recollection of the ghosts' faces would find its way into a paper, or perhaps a late-night confession to a close friend, but likely it would remain an unspoken truth. She stepped down onto the sidewalk, letting the library recede behind her. In the days and weeks that followed, rumors floated around campus of a power surge that caused the lights to go out in part of the library. Some students whispered that they had felt a chill, that they had glimpsed silhouettes in the corners, and that the building seemed alive with tension on that particular night. But most chalked it up to typical superstition around midterm stress and thunderstorms. Life went on, and the library was once again a quiet place for reading and research. Yet for Ruth, the memory of that night left an imprint. She often found herself gazing at passages of famous authors' final works with a new depth of empathy. She understood now that words carry echoes of their writer's breath, that creation and destruction could entwine upon the page. At times, she wondered if the ghosts lingered still, perhaps hidden in margins not read aloud. But as the weeks rolled into months, no more specters appeared to her. The illusions no longer haunted her dreams, and she was able to sleep again without hearing phantom whisperings near her pillow. She focused more intently on her doctoral work, with a renewed reverence for the power of language. One late afternoon, she decided to stop by Mr. Whitby's office. To her surprise, the door was locked and the lights were off. She peeked through the small glass window in the door, uncertain. A passing colleague mentioned that Mr. Whitby had taken a leave of absence. No details given, just a short notice posted in the staff lounge that he would be away indefinitely. The colleague shrugged, as if it were just another piece of staff gossip. She felt a pang of concern. Had the previous ordeal shaken him more than he'd let on? She found herself wondering if the ghosts had left some lasting mark on him. Perhaps he needed time to heal from memories that still haunted him. Eventually, she made her way to the main hall. The clock's steady ticking soothed her. She couldn't resist stepping closer, resting a hand gently on the polished wood. She thought of the hidden compartment behind the face, of the final page that had saved them, sealed away now, presumably locked in the archives beneath new protective measures, far from prying eyes, far from curious minds who might risk reading those lines out loud and unleashing a darkness best left in silent pages. Ruth closed her eyes, inhaling the familiar perfume of old tomes. An echo of a distant presence tugged at her senses, a faint impression of watchers from beyond. But it vanished the next moment, replaced by the calm hush of the library. She turned and walked toward the exit, the built-up hush following like a curtain slowly drawn on a stage when the final act has ended. Stepping outside, the sun's warmth reassured her. She tucked her jacket closer and set off across campus, each footstep embracing the gift of daylight. And though the library's secrets lingered like an ink stain on her consciousness, she carried on with the knowledge that words, however lovely or forbidden, would always hold the power to conjure the living, the dead, and the intangible realm connecting them.